Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kim Ricketts, and I co-manage the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series along with Kirsten Wiley. Today, we welcome Gary Marcus here to discuss his work on the strange way the human mind works that can perhaps be understood by studying the evolution of that mind. Why we would like to believe that our minds are evolved in some sort of a rational way. How can we then explain the many ways our minds blip, stumble, and fall short? How can we solve the quirks of human cognition, and do we even want to? With computers gaining, or more truthfully, surpassing us in every kind of rational work, what role is there for the kluge-like brain that we have? Well, Dr. Marcus is going to talk about all those things today and maybe some ways around the brain blips that we were just mentioning. Gary Marcus is a professor of psychology at NYU and director of the NYU Infant Language Learning Center. He's the author of The Birth of the Mind and the editor of the Norton Psychology Reader, has been a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. So please join me in welcoming to research Gary Marcus.
Thank you very much. I've been traveling a lot, and if I start to cough maniacally, it's nothing personal. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start with a very optimistic view of the human mind. Things may go downhill from there. This is a remark by Hamlet. What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty. It's a very comforting thought. It'd be nice if it were true. And people that have spoken in this very room, or at least on this very campus, have advocated something like that in a more technical way in the cognitive sciences. So Steven Pinker, in his book How the Mind Works, he was my graduate advisor, wrote that the parts of the mind that allow us to see are indeed well engineered. And I think he's right about that first part. So human vision, I think, still far exceeds anything I know about in machine vision. There may be things that go along inside these walls that are not public yet that are making machines push the edges of what computers can do. But no commercially available technology at this point is any match for the human eye when it comes to, say, looking at obstacles while you're driving or looking at different animals and identifying them quickly and so forth. So some parts of the human mind are very well adapted. Another example is the system that allows us to grasp things is extremely well adapted. So we can pick up things at all kinds of different angles, and our hands just sort of naturally go in the ways that they're supposed to go. So Pinker argues from there, and I think this is an example of what philosophers might call a slippery slope argument. He says, well, if the mind is very well adapted when it comes to vision and very well adapted when it comes to motor control, then maybe that should just be a general model for how it is that the mind works. And he says, there's no reason, this is always a phrase that I think should have you grasping for your wallet. He says there is no reason to think that the quality of engineering progressively deteriorates as the information flows upstream to the faculties that interpret and act on what we see. So the idea is if vision is good, then maybe the rest of thought is just as soundly organized. You see a different strand of this, really for very different reasons, in Noam Chomsky's recent writings. Pinker is driven by evolution, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Chomsky is not really that interested in evolution, but he comes to this from a perspective of mathematical elegance. And Chomsky says that language appears to be surprisingly perfect, coming close to what some super engineer would construct, given the conditions that the language faculty must satisfy. And I won't bore you with all of the recent citations in the technical literature and the cognitive sciences where I work, but suffice to say there are lots of people that have made these kinds of arguments over the last 10 or 20 years. So there was an influential paper by a Carnegie Mellon psychologist, John Anderson, saying many of the major characteristics of human cognition can be explained as an optimal response. And that continues now, for example, in a theory that some of you might have heard of, Bayesian decision theory. It's a very popular thing in cognitive science, which basically tries to suggest that the mind is pretty optimal about making certain kinds of decisions. This is all well and good. Behind this enthusiasm seems to be the implicit assumption or implicit confidence in evolution. So some of you may have heard of John Tooby and Lita Cosmides. They're the founder of the field evolutionary psychology that Pinker has drawn heavily on. And here's a pretty typical argument. They sort of acknowledge the possibility that evolution might not be perfect briefly, very briefly, and then they turn to this other argument and they say because natural selection is a hill climbing process that tends to choose the best of the variant designs that actually appear, and because of the immense numbers of alternatives that appear over the vast expanse of evolutionary time, natural selection tends to cause the accumulation of superlatively well-engineered functional designs. And that's again, it's very comforting, but perhaps there's some reason to question it. So there's all of this optimism about what evolution might do, but it seems obvious that there are still, whoops, my animations are out of order, which is so sad. Whoops, my animation didn't work at all. That's even sadder. You were supposed to see over here a picture of our dear president, George W. Bush, and so you will have to simply imagine Bush blowing a bubble and not looking very confident. I'm sorry that picture didn't show up. But the general idea is that it's not just the president. So, I mean, the president might be a challenge to the notion that we are infinite in reason or noble in faculty or anything like that, but it's not just him. So, for example, 18 months after the invasion, the second invasion of Iraq, it was still the case that 70% of Republican voters apparently thought that there were weapons of mass destruction somewhere to be found, despite a lot of evidence to the contrary. And until recent, I mean, it's easy for us to think about how clever we are when we all have access to the internet and all of modern technology, but when you think about what a human raised alone in, say, a desert island might think about, well, until recently, many members of our species believed in things like ghosts, witches, astrology, animal spirits, and so forth. So is it really reasonable to think of the human mind as superlatively well-engineered? Humans are often pretty impressive creatures, but that certainly doesn't mean that they're always impressive. So it would be the fallacy of composition, as rhetoricians describe it, to say because we're impressive in some domains that we're impressive in all domains. I come closer to the view that Bertrand Russell expressed when he was thinking of Aristotle here. Aristotle said that man is a rational animal, and Russell says, well, all my life I've been searching for evidence which could support this. So what gives? Why can't we reconcile the optimism of evolutionary psychology that says, you know, over vast expanses of time, the mind's going to work pretty darn well, with the reality that we've got, you know, a president who is limited in cognitive faculty? Well, the first problem, I think, with the optimistic view is that it's conflating the long expanses of evolution with the short history of humans. So there's been evolution on this planet for I guess, roughly 1 billion years, but most of that evolution came before we came on the scene. And that means two things. One is that the things that we most identify with ourselves, that are most characteristically human, like our somewhat clumsy efforts at rationality, those are really new. So language, the ability to think deliberately, those are things that have been around for like 100,000 years. So that's just a very short period in evolutionary time, and that leaves a lot of room for debugging and some other stuff that I'll talk about in a moment. The second is that the optimistic view in general wildly overestimates how clever evolution is. So we've already seen this common metaphor, Richard Dawkins uses it, lots of people use it, of evolution as a hill climber. And there's some truth to it. So there are some processes by which over time things just get better and better and better. They sort of steadily get better. So Richard Dawkins' famous example here is vision. He says, he picks up on William Paley's old argument that the eye must be the product of intelligent design, and says, well, not at all. You could take a creature that had 2% of an eye, and if its offspring had 3% of an eye, then its offspring would do better than somebody else that had only 2% of an eye. And so you can imagine you're sort of slowly climbing up that hill, and if you give it enough time, you'll get to the top of the hill. I think that there are some things that really work that way, which you might think of as very smooth evolutionary landscapes, where each possible change is a little bit better, and you get cumulative evolution. The problem with this metaphor is that the evolutionary landscape is often actually pretty rocky. So it's not always the case that we're simply climbing up the hill to the sort of each next thing, if we take gradual steps, is necessarily going to be the best thing. So you can imagine that this is the Himalayas rather than Mount Fuji. If you're in the Himalayas, you might get to some peak, you might get fairly high on some mountain, but there might be other mountains off in the distance that are much higher, that are much better. There might be other designs that are vastly superior to the designs that we actually find. And sometimes evolution does goof. So, for example, there's the human spine. Probably most of the people in this room have gotten to the stage in their life where the human spine is a source of trouble. The human spine is pretty good in some ways. It keeps us upright. It allows us to free our hands. But it's clumsy and it's inelegant. It's not the ideal way in which you might support the weight of a biped. Much better might be like some 4-column design that had shock absorbers, and you could go over bumps like a car, and it would, everything would be a lot better. But evolution can't anticipate that. And instead, we wind up with what engineers might call a kludge. And I don't know how many engineers we actually have in the room, so I don't know if this is a word that everybody in the room knows or a word that only a few people in the room know. It's not actually in general circulation, although I'm trying to sort of bring it that way. But as the engineers in the room will know, a kludge is a clumsy or inelegant solution to a problem. Again, I have problems with it. Oh, no. Okay. Here's a nice example that I saw last year. Graduate student bolts air conditioner onto car to beat Texas heat. It works. It keeps the car cool, but it's not the most elegant solution in town. So that's a pretty good example of a kludge. And for anybody else, I'm going to skip that one. There are different reasons that one might, well, actually I'll come back to it in a second. There's another example would be from Apollo 13. My favorite scene in the movie of Apollo 13 was when they had to cobble together a substitute air filter using whatever was basically available on the capsule, and that included things like duct tape and socks and so forth. So they wound up with a substitute air filter. As the lead astronaut said, the contraption wasn't very handsome, but it worked. That's what it is to be a kludge, and that's what I'm going to try to argue the human mind is something that's not particularly elegant, but it gets the job done. There are other reasons to make kludges. Engineers do them because they're in a hurry. MacGyver presumably did it for the television ratings. This is one of my favorite examples where he took a bunch of floor mats and some duct tape and made running shoes out of it so he could get out of town in a hurry. One can think indefinitely about the different kinds of kludges that people might make. Evolution builds kludges basically for three reasons. The first is that it has no foresight. Evolution can't look ahead and say, this looks like it's going to be a bad design. A single column, that worked for the four-legged creatures because it distributed the load across a plank, and that's a perfectly sensible kind of solution. But if we turn that 90 degrees, an intelligent designer would have said, that's going to be a bad idea. What works for a plank doesn't work for a flagpole. So you mean to tell me you're going to go now with a flagpole, you're going to put all of the weight in this one spot, you're going to put this big heavy brain on top and make it carry the shoulders? That's just a bad idea. But evolution can't do that. Any sensible engineer would have said, there are better ways to distribute this weight. And evolution has no hindsight. So we've been stuck with bad backs for something like 1 million years, depends on how you count, and it hasn't gotten any better. There are actually small changes within the part of design space that evolution wound up. So evolution wound up in the design space where you've got a single column design, and it did a pretty good job with that. So for example, pregnant women have special curvature in their spines to allow them to bear the unusual loads of carrying an embryo around with them. So evolution gets into a particular part of the landscape, and it does the best that it can with that landscape. But it can't say, better would be if we wound up in a different part of the landscape altogether. It can't do that in foresight. It can't do that in hindsight. And there's a third problem, which is evolution is always in a hurry. Evolution is like an engineer with a ship now kind of deadline. Evolution can never say, let's take this species offline. Let's think about it. It does some things very well, some other things not very well. Let's just take a couple of years and maybe we'll rebuild the operating system. Right? Evolution can't do that. It's under constant pressure, essentially. It is constant pressure, such that at any given moment, all that matters is which genes are propagating. There's no opportunity to overhaul anything. Even more, in Darwin's word, all evolution becomes a process of descent with modification. That means that anything that you see on the planet now, biological, has some kind of history, and it represents small modifications on whatever came before it. So we're pretty different from bacteria, but there's this uninterrupted chain of organisms in between where each one is a little bit different from the last one. Another way of putting that is evolution always builds new stuff on top of old stuff. And sometimes that's not such a good idea. And the human spine is one example of that. Our spine is built on the design. It's a modification of the genes involved in building the spine of a quadruped, of a four-legged creature. It's built on that old design, but that's not the best thing to do. What you wind up with is tinkering. That's really on my next slide, I guess. Francois Jacob, who was one of the people who figured out what genes actually do. Everybody knows Watson and Crick figured out the structure of DNA, but Francois Jacob helped to figure out that what genes actually do is they switch on and off in response to environmental cues around a particular gene. He has this wonderful phrase that I think really captures the spirit of evolution. Evolution is not an optimizer like a lot of sort of loose evolutionary psychology might lead you to believe. It's really more like a tinkerer who often, without knowing what he's going to produce, uses whatever he finds around him, old cardboards, pieces of string, fragments of wood or metal, to make some kind of workable object. And where there's tinkering, there's going to be kludging. The key idea really in today's talk is the idea of evolutionary inertia, that once evolution is set in motion in a particular direction, it tends to continue in that direction. I think there's some biologists in the room, you can think of this in genetic terms, that once you've got a set of genes, it's much more likely that you'll have small modifications to those genes and have a viable offspring than that you should sort of change 300 genes simultaneously. It's not impossible, but it's like, could we ever evolve pigs that fly? I can't say no way would there ever be an offspring pig that would fly, but that would require so many genetic changes to happen simultaneously that it's astonishingly unlikely. It's not zero, but it's very, very unlikely. And in general, evolution, basically what it has to do is to work with what's already there. So you have this notion of inertia. Once something's in motion, like a single column design, it's very rare that that gets changed. And here's the real point of the talk. It's not just the spine. So in biology in general, the kind of points that I've already made are not really surprising. So every developmental biologist understands the notion of descent with modification. Sort of standard thinking in biology. Stephen Jay Gould used to talk about it. He talked about examples like the panda's thumb. He described those as remnants of history, that would, the strange and the sort of incongruous, that would tell us something about the past. So biologists understand this basic idea, but somehow it hasn't been imported into psychology. Perhaps for sociological reasons, most of the discussion of evolution in psychology has been about this optimization stuff, about, look how efficient the system is in terms of how promiscuous men are as opposed to women, and how that would, make sense in the environment of adaptation and so forth. Most of what you see in evolutionary psychology is discussions of optimality, not of the kind of stuff I'm talking about evolutionary inertia, where maybe there would be limits on how our minds work based on things that might have happened a few 100 million years ago that we're stuck with. And that's basically what I'm going to try to tell you about in the rest. So my running example today is going to be human memory, because I think it's sort of the root of much cognitive evil. And in a moment, I'll tell you sort of how human memory works, how biological memory in general works. It's a system that I call Q-driven, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But first, I want to either introduce you or refresh your memory, depending on whether you're a professional programmer or not, to the most salient alternative. So we have biological memory. It's got its advantages. It's got its disadvantages. I'll explain how that works in a minute. But it's good to sort of take a step back and say, well, how else could things have gone? So just like I can say, we could consider a spinal system where there would be 4 columns instead of 1. We can consider a different way of constructing memory, and we can say, are there any virtues to that? And computers are the obvious place to look. So as most of you probably already know, but maybe not all, every piece of information in a computer is assigned a specific location. That's how the whole thing works. So there's some kind of master map that says this is going to be in this location, this is going to be in that location, and so forth. So at the machine level, maybe not at the programmer's level, but at the machine level, everything is retrieved based on where it is. I want the contents of register 372. That's basically how computers work. Probably most of you already know that. For those who don't, you can think of an analogy here, which is safe deposit boxes. You could imagine a whole array of safe deposit boxes. You put information, you put some set of papers in a particular box, and once it's there, it stays there. And that's the sort of beauty of computer memory, is you put something in a particular spot in the computer memory once, and it stays there. We would be very well off if we could do the same thing. So for example, I can program my cell phone once with a phone number, and it will stay, as long as I make backups and so forth, forever. But the human memory is a lot less reliable. So for me, the typical thing is I get a cell phone call. Somebody doesn't have caller ID, and they leave the message, and they say, "Hi, Gary, can you call me back? My number is 423-7168. In area code 415. And when they get to in the area code 415, it completely interferes with everything else that I heard. And then I'm frantically trying to remember which button do I press in order to replay the message. And I can't remember that either. And soon, if I don't have a piece of paper or some other external aid, I am in deep trouble. So we can't really usually learn things on one trial the way that computers can. We often need to hear things many times before we learn them well. I remember my Latin teacher telling me as I was trying to learn Latin vocabulary, he said 3 times for the normal mind. His point being that you couldn't just expect to scan the page and immediately learn the vocabulary words. Unfortunately, I think he was much too optimistic, or either that or I was very subnormal. 3 times was certainly not enough for me to learn Latin words. Sometimes even the most basic things that you would think any optimal or sensibly designed system would be able to handle are completely outside of our grasp. So for example, consider the question of where did I put my keys? Most of the time we actually get that right, and it's characteristic of human memory that most of the time we access our memories, they do well, but certain questions like these are really hard for our memory. So when you ask your memory, where did I put my keys? Well, in an ideally engineered system, you would have something like a buffer that would update every time that you put your keys. You would just replace the old value. You don't need to know where you put your keys last week, right? That's totally useless information now. You would replace that useless information with the latest information. Okay, I've come home, I've put my keys in my pocket or something like that, and you would simply remember that. But what actually happens is you ask your memory, you consult your memory, you say, where did I put my keys? And you get all of the memories sort of thrown together. So the memories of where you put your keys last week, even though they're completely useless, they still come forth to your mind, and you still have trouble remembering where your keys are. Same thing with where did I put my car. If you park in the same lot every day, you can easily remember what lot your car is in, but you can easily be confused with where you put your car the day before, even though that's completely irrelevant information. And just to make sure that you realize that this isn't just little stuff like where did you put your keys, I have one of my favorite statistics in the bottom, which pertains to another kind of case where memory interference can actually be fatal. So if you are either flying a plane or jumping out of a plane or something like that, you need to follow a certain set of steps every time. But the way that the mind is constructed, all of these different memories interfere with one another. We don't have access to the most recent case. So it actually turns out that 6% of all skydiving fatalities can be traced to people forgetting to pull the cord. So that's a sign of how weak our memories can be. The reason that our memory is not particularly reliable is that we lack the master memories that computers have. We have no idea where, beyond something vague like in my brain, our particular memories are. So I can tell you, yes, memories are in either the frontal lobes or the hippocampus or some combination of the two. But nobody can tell me where the particular memory of where I put my keys this morning is as compared to the memory of where I put my keys last week. Nobody has any idea at that level. And I would actually submit to you that even the brain doesn't know that. So it could have been that I just couldn't bring it to consciousness. So the rules of language, for example, I obey them every time I speak, but I don't know them. But they're there. So those rules exist. But I'm not sure that the brain even knows where information is stored. I think that what actually happens is there's something like what I call a broadcasting model. So the idea is there are many different memories, and I send out a signal, and any memory that happens to have any information that's relevant responds. And if there's just one thing that's relevant, that's great. If there are many things, like the many different memories of the keys, then you get interference and you have trouble remembering. So a metaphor that I would use is that our memory is something more like an old shoebox full of photographs. It's kind of all there, but we have a lot of trouble accessing the particular bits of information that we want. And that's because we don't know the specific locations for where anything is stored. In technical terms, our memories are driven by cues. Instead of knowing where a particular memory is, we try to use cues, sort of like in a search engine, to try to retrieve those bits of information. But it's not set up as well as a search engine. So if I tell you something like, I'm trying to think of an American president, and he was the 16th in line, probably everybody in this room, or at least everybody who grew up in the United States, saw that bit of information once. And when you compare to a computer, like somebody could type that into Wikipedia. They could type in a whole list of American presidents, and one person types that in, it propagates across the net, and it's essentially a permanent memory. But if I ask you, who was the 16th president, most people, except American history buffs, would have a lot of trouble with that. And then I can give you clues, like I could tell you, the one I'm thinking of is a good writer. And if you happen yourself to be a writer, that would probably actually tell you, because, Lord knows W is not a good writer, and so it kind of narrows it down. But for most people, that probably wouldn't help either, and so you'd need more clues. So eventually I get to something like, he freed the slaves, and hopefully everybody would figure it out at that point. If I had, in extreme dire conditions, I could say, he's the dude with a tall hat and long beard, and everybody would eventually get to Abraham Lincoln. But the point is that we can't just zoom into a table and say, okay, I want number 16, like maybe Schwarzenegger could have done in Total Recall. We don't have that. What we have to do is use these cues, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. There are many weird consequences of this fact. So, for example, our memories are really, really tied to context. So if you learn something while you're sitting down and then you try to remember it later while you're standing up, you have a little bit smaller chance than if you tried to remember it later while you were sitting down. We're so desperate to find any clue that we can to help us remind ourselves that we use things like our posture. One of my favorite studies looked at scuba divers. They memorized a list of words while they were underwater. came back a couple days later, and then they were either tested while they were again underwater or while they were on land. The facts had nothing to do with scuba diving, but people did better with a tube in their mouth than they did on land, because that was a similar circumstance, and the brain uses that as a cue. My undergraduates are always curious in the fact on the bottom. It's not actually a fact, and they all volunteer to give me empirical evidence, but anyway. For better or worse, we're stuck with the memory system that we have. This is, I think, the sort of paramount example of evolutionary inertia. Context-dependent memory or context-driven memory, it works reasonably well. I think what would work a lot better is the kind of system you find in search engines, where you've got location-addressable memory, like in computers, underlying a set of cues. So, I mean, there are obviously much better systems of memory. Any search engine, basically, is an existence proof for that. But what we have is just the cue-driven memory, with no notion of where individual things are located. And that's because it's been around for a really long time, and our genomes are just organized around that at this point. You find this kind of system in bacteria, you find this kind of system in snails, in flies, or sorry, not bacteria, but flies, snails, and so forth. You find it in rodents. It was originally discovered in rats. You find it in monkeys. This is just a pervasive part of the animal world. So the argument that I want to make is that context-dependent memory is the kind of runaway train of evolution. It's the single fact maybe that most shapes our mental lives in ways that are not necessarily optimal, because we're stuck with this memory system. Evolution doesn't have the foresight to say, you know, it would be better if we took a cue from search engines and kind of tried to fiddle with it. Evolution can't do that. So some examples of this are pretty obvious. Like humans, and maybe this will come up in a moment, or maybe it will go 10 bullet points instantly. Hopefully we'll return. One good example of this is eyewitness testimony. So in eyewitness testimony, here we go with the 10. In eyewitness testimony, we want to remember a specific fact, and that's exactly what our brains are not cut out to do. So I don't know if anybody saw this trial in New York a few weeks ago. The events took place a few years ago. A guy was shot on the subway, and 50 people saw it. He was shot by a police officer. And the question was, what exactly happened? Was a justified shooting? Should the police officer not have shot? They interviewed 50 people, and every one of them had a different story. They couldn't even figure out what the guy said before the officer pulled the trigger. This is a sign of, I think, how weak our ability is to pick out specific memories. What's going on there? Everybody saw the events. They probably, if you would ask them at the very moment after the events, had at least more similar stories than they ultimately did. But people think about things afterwards. They produce new memories, and then when you use those cues to pull out the specific memories, you can't remember what you actually saw from what you thought about, what the lawyer asked you about, what you read in the newspaper, and so forth. We don't have, for example, time date stamps. So every time every time you use a file, Windows updates the last time that it was touched. There's this timestamp for when you used it. The brain has nothing like it. If it did, it would be a simple matter. You'd say, I just want the memories on the day of the shooting, period. But we can't do that. Beyond this, beyond the fact that memory per se is problematic, that it's sort of not cut out for some of the things we might want to do as modern humans, it has a lot of consequence for the rest of our lives. So I'll give you a few examples. One is our vulnerability to spin doctors. So probably not one person in the room would think that a death tax is a good idea. I think this was one of the most brilliant pieces of marketing in the last 10 years. Nobody would like a death tax because death is a terrible thing. Nobody wants to die. It seems like a total gyp that we have to die. And then to go take somebody's money after they die, that just seems awful, right? So it seems like a terrible thing. But of course, it's the same thing as an estate tax. And an estate tax doesn't sound so bad because who has estates? Well, wealthy people have estates, and we think they don't pay enough taxes, so it's fine. Go ahead, tax the rich, nobody minds. It's the same thing, right? And even people who know that it's the same thing really have a hard time thinking about them in the same way. Well, why is that? It's because the way that our memories work, they serve up different information depending on how you code it. And here a phrase that probably all the computer programmers in the room know is very apt, which is garbage in, garbage out. So our reasoning systems are actually fairly well designed, I think, but they're at the mercy of our memory systems. And our memory systems make us reason about different things, or the same thing, rather, depending on how it's described. Same thing with soap, right? You hear it's 99% pure, and you're like, oh, yeah, this is almost organic. This is great. And then you get to you think, if you ever think about it the other way, you're like, oh, but this is 1% toxic. Maybe I'll just put it back on the shelf, right? It's the same thing. But again, the memories that get pulled up are entirely different because purity brings up one set of memories in your mind automatically because we're cue-driven creatures. So this is called framing. The reason that it matters, or the reason that it's effective, is because of the structure of our memory. If we could search our memories in a systematic way like computers would, this whole phenomena of framing, people like George Lakoff have written about it quite a bit, this whole phenomena wouldn't exist if we were more able to be systematic about the information that we put into our reasoning systems. This also makes us dreadful at scientific reasoning. So I think one of our biggest weaknesses as human beings is we have what's called confirmation bias. So I tell you some theory, you start to believe the theory, then you notice all the evidence that confirms that theory, and you never think about the other theories, the other possibilities. One technical term for this is premature closure. So you hear another is make sense reasoning. You hear an argument, makes sense to you, you accept that, and then you just keep adding more evidence on that side, and you don't look at the other side for evidence that might counter your theories. This is terrible news, of course, for scientists, and scientists have to battle this all the time, and I don't think that they're entirely effective. I mean, you can look at, say, journal article reviews, and when the journal article reviewer agrees with the person who submitted with the article, they're like, yep, this is a great paper, publish it right away. And when they disagree, then they work really hard to try to find counter evidence. I think that this confirmation bias, which I'm arguing stems itself from the nature of our memories, is one of the biggest things that gets in the way of human beings getting along with one another. That may sound like an exaggeration, but I think that the fundamental thing that happens in most conflict, if it's not over land or money, is it's over ideas. And if everybody has confirmation bias, what winds up happening is that everybody gets polarized. Everybody has their own view. They think the other view is silly. So I mean, you can think of like Obama versus Clinton, right? Everybody becomes completely attached to their own choice of candidate. So I have become completely attached to my choice of candidate, which is Obama. I will tell you, my father has become attached to Clinton, and we'll have these kind of arguments. And we're each very good at selling the virtues of our particular candidate, and neither one of us is really, to be perfectly honest, completely listening to the other person about the virtues on the other side. And we're not able to come up with them either. So the virtues of Obama just spring to my mind the way the virtues of Clinton maybe spring to his. Another example of this is the question of how much work did a particular person contribute to a problem. So let's say the dishes. You ask a bunch of roommates, how much did you do? How much of the dishes did you do? One person says 60%, the other says 70%, the other says 52%. It never, ever adds up to 100%. The answer is always higher than 100%. It's the same thing in scientific papers, as some of you may know. The professor thinks they had 80% of the ideas. The graduate student thinks they had 80% of the ideas. And when it comes to who should be the first author on the paper, it's often a source of conflict. Well, why is that? It's because everybody can have better access to their memories about what they did than to their memories about what other people did. And this is the real kicker, we're not very good at automatically compensating for that. So you can actually train yourself to say, well, when it comes to arguments with my wife about the dishes, I'm really going to try to factor in the fact that I'm probably better able to remember my instances of the dishes than hers, and I actually try to do this. But that doesn't come naturally. That's something that you have to actually study. It's not like when human beings come out of the factory, so to speak, that we're born ready to compensate for the data. We're not born knowing, like pollsters, about getting representative samples of data and so forth. And our memories are really not designed to give us representative samples. Cue-driven memory also contributes to mental illness. So consider, for example, what happens when somebody, let's say, loses their job. What happens is they think of a lot of negative things. And those negative things make them think of more negative things. They start to play the blues, they start to listen to a lot of breakup songs, and soon you have a spiral. You have a ruminative cycle where all you can think about is the negative stuff, and it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. So you have that kind of spiral. There's paranoia. Once you have real reason to mistrust one person, you can get in the same sort of spiral where it just gets worse and worse and worse. This is, again, a consequence, I think, of our memories. You could make an argument that suicide is actually an example of what statisticians call a post hoc maximum, which is you pick the individual case that's sort of least representative, most extreme. This is like when the baseball announcers say that he's gotten hits in 10 of his last 11 at-bats, not counting the whole season. A suicidal person notices, the last 2 days were really bad. They don't take a moving average of all of the data over their lives, and the day in which they actually commit suicide is probably this sort of very unrepresentative case. I wanted to skip this one, actually. Pay no attention to that slide. I think that another thing that memory can help explain, the structure of human memory and this evolutionary inertia argument can help explain, is why human languages aren't as precise as computer language. So Noam Chomsky is fond of talking about a space of human, the space of possible languages and where human languages fall in it. So the idea behind universal grammar is there are many kinds of languages you can imagine in the world, and only some of them are actual human languages. And it turns out, for example, that those languages are different from computer languages. So all computer languages operate differently from all human languages. And you could say the same thing about mathematics, and people that have too much time on their hands apparently actually go to immersion courses and try to learn things like Klingon, and those have yet another structure. So you can say, where does human languages fit in against the space of mathematical languages, Klingon, and so forth and so on. I would say that one of the most salient things about human language from a design perspective is that we have ambiguity. One of the most salient differences between human languages and programming languages. We have not just the possibility of being ambiguous when you want to be vague. Somebody asks you for a date and you're not quite sure what you want to say and you want to keep your options open. But we have a lot of inadvertent ambiguity. So we have sentences like the spy shot the cop with the revolver. And you might hear that as the cop has the revolver. You might hear it as the spy has the revolver. But either of those is a legitimate way of parsing the sentence. People who work on natural language processing realize that most sentences are actually ambiguous. We don't usually notice that because we usually rely on context to help make sense of things. But the language itself, the literal string in human language, is much more ambiguous than in the machine language. Again, there are examples from the flight world in which these sorts of things become very dangerous, like a plane crash in which I think something like 583 people died because somebody's answer to a question was ambiguous. The mission control said to the pilot, "Where are you?" And he said, "At takeoff." And there was an ambiguity whether that meant that he was about to take off or whether he had already taken off, and there was a plane crash. Lots of philosophers have noticed this problem, that languages are ambiguous. But I would put it to you that your average human being couldn't learn an unambiguous language even if you tried. So people since Leibniz have been trying to make sort of better human languages, and there are things like Esperanto and so forth. The best example of this, and this will bring me back to Klingon in a minute for those Star Trek fans in the room. The best example of this was a language called Logland, for logical language. And there's a Scientific American paper in 1960, which I commend to you all, in which he tried to create an artificial language that was essentially perfect. And the idea was he was going to test a very famous hypothesis called the Whorf hypothesis. The Whorf hypothesis is that the language that you think affects the way that you think. There's not actually, as it turns out, a lot of evidence for that. Like, people have looked for things like the famous case was that Hopi speakers didn't have words for time, and then it turns out it was just bad linguistics and they actually did have words for time. So there hasn't been a lot of evidence for this hypothesis over the years, but James Cook Brown had a very clever way to think about this, which he said, I'll make a language that draws on what we've learned from computer science, that's logically rigorous, and that'll force people to think in a clear fashion, or so he hoped. That'll make them make all of their assumptions clear and explicit and be sort of like logic. And then I'll be able to test the Whorf hypothesis. I'll be able to see, well, if I give people this very systematic language, will they be able to think clearly at long last? There was only one problem with the plan, which is nobody was ever able to actually learn the language. Imposing perfection on human languages might actually be like trying to put a square peg into a round hole. In a computer language, ambiguity is easily avoided by things like parentheses or indenting or things like that. But we're not very good at actually representing things like that. So if somebody actually tries to use Lisp, they need the computer to flash the right parentheses with the left parentheses in order for people to even know where they match up. So I think that the reason that we have the kind of structure that we do for natural languages, where there's ambiguity, there's no clear way of demarking which pieces go with which other pieces, is because we don't have the sort of brain that could use the simplest technique for solving that problem, which would be to have parentheses that line up and tell you which piece goes with which. Instead, we kludge things together. We use context, we use our tone of voice, and so forth. It sort of gets the job done, and it sort of doesn't. There's still lots of sentences that we just can never disambiguate that I'd talk about on another day. The last part of what I wanted to discuss today is this question. Is there anything that we can do about our evolved cognitive limitations? Clearly, I need to clean up my Macintosh. As they say in Alcoholics Anonymous, recognition is the first step. So the thesis of the sort of end of the book is if we can look at what our cognitive limitations are, we might be able to do something about them. So part of the book is as close as I've ever come as a practicing scientist to writing a self-help manual. I give a bunch of particular suggestions that are all based on empirical research that all fit with the idea that we are fundamentally kludgy, that try to tell us how we could cope. So there are things like, whenever possible, consider alternative hypotheses. Imagine all your decisions will be spot-checked. And don't set goals, don't just set goals, make specific contingency plans that are of the form, if you're in this very particular circumstance, then do this particular thing, which works because there's a kind of disconnect between our ancestral brain mechanisms that are all about reflexes and our modern brain mechanisms that are all about making deliberate plans. So usually we make deliberate plans, but we don't figure out what we would do in the moment in order to follow those plans. And then when push comes to shove, we're sort of on autopilot and the plans don't get fulfilled. So we can find tricks to translate between the systems that allow us to do better. Some of these suggestions might seem banal, but there's good empirical evidence that each one of them makes a significant difference. What I want to focus on now, however, is not what we could do for ourselves, but what I could imagine we could do for our educational system. So I think that our school systems are still at least largely stuck in the 19th century. And I say this partly based on the kinds of students that come into NYU and the kind of training that they've had. I think, at least when I was in school, basically emphasis was on facts. You teach children facts. There was the line in Dickens, now what I want is facts. Teach those boys and girls nothing but facts, plant nothing else, and root out everything else. And I think that still goes on. So there are some facts that you absolutely must memorize, like the multiplication table. You can't really be a fiscally numerate person in society without knowing a multiplication table. But there are lots of facts that we still waste our children's time with, like state capitals or something like that. You could just easily look up on Wikipedia. I don't think there's any reason that people have to remember them, which would free up time for something else. And what's that something else? I think it would be useful to teach children something about how our own minds work, to sort of give children a user's guide to the human mind. So we already teach our children about digestion in science class, and we teach them about circulation. But I think the average school teaches children almost nothing about how our actual brains work. We could teach children this. We could teach them where we are vulnerable to bias, where our reasoning breaks down, where our memories can't be trusted, all the kinds of things that I'm talking about. And there's actually some good evidence that this could work. So there's a book called Harry Stadelmeyer's Discovery that people have started using as part of a curriculum. And it starts by this young child being asked, what is the most interesting thing in the world? And this child is clearly a child after my own heart. He says, to me, the most interesting thing in the world is thinking. I know that lots of other things are also very important and wonderful, like electricity and magnetism and gravitation, but although we can understand them, they can't understand us. So thinking must be very special. And people started to use this as a basis of a curriculum. 10 to 12-year-old children have been exposed to a version of this sort of philosophy for children. They're exposed for 16 months, not for very long, an hour a week, and it actually appears to make, I mean, there's not a lot of data here yet, but the preliminary data suggests that this helps children with their verbal intelligence, their nonverbal intelligence, their self-confidence, their independence, and so forth. So I would suggest that if we devised a curriculum around recognizing our own mental limitations, it might actually be extremely helpful. So to sum up, or actually to give you last words, no guide to the human mind is ever going to give our memory, for example, the power to solve square roots in our heads. The days where John Henry was racing the steam engine, they're over. There's no point in trying to train individuals to do the work that a calculator can do, and there's lots of stuff we can leave to Wikipedia, and I think we need to sort of choose our spots. There are lots of things that are wrong with the human mind. This sort of book goes through many more than I've discussed today, but I don't think it's worthwhile to redress every one of them. We don't need to be machines, but at the same time, there are some things that we can do that I think would help us get along better and help get through the world better. Training ourselves, for example, to consider evidence in more balanced ways, to be sensitive to biases in reasoning, figuring out ways of choosing actions that fit our goals, and so forth. The basic idea here that I want to get across is if we can learn to recognize our own limitations, we have a chance to outwit our inner kludge. And I thank you very much. I would be happy to take questions, I guess, online or in person. I've never quite done the online thing before, but I would give first precedence to anybody in the room who would like to ask a question. Sir?
Aren't we probably designed for something more than just logical thinking anyway? I mean, we have to survive all sorts of insults from the environment, and so doing things by quick rules of thumb rather than short-circuiting the logic process might be effective. Also, we have to be durable and fault-tolerant of that sort.
I mean, I certainly think that that we are not in fact designed to be logical. So logic is something that we have to learn, like reading. So you can compare logic with reading, where as opposed to speaking. So speaking comes naturally. We all do it automatically. Reading takes a lot of instruction, and logic is the same way. So there's great cross-cultural studies that show that if you go out in the wild, people have no idea what you're talking about when you give them a syllogism. And you say, all bears are white in Siberia. This is a bear in Siberia. Is it white? The average person who has not been exposed to Western culture or to some kind of literate culture has no idea about that. So first part of what you're asking is, or you're sort of implicitly saying, is logic doesn't come natural, and maybe it shouldn't. And it's certainly true that it doesn't come natural, and it's certainly true that lots of human beings get by without it. I would also say that, yes, for sure, there are lots of cases where we use heuristics and shortcuts, and sometimes they work out and sometimes they don't. So confirmation bias is, in a way, a heuristic, but it leads us to self-delusion, basically, and it does that on a pretty regular basis, so that people tend to be overconfident about almost all of their beliefs, and I don't think that that's such a good thing. So there's a trade-off. There are things that are maybe facilitated, but if you take, for example, the case of memory, the specific case that I've talked about today, I think search engines are an existence proof that you could sort of have your cake and eat it. So search engines give us all of the flexibility, all of the speed, all of the sort of fault tolerance that the brain has, but they also give us a greater degree of reliability. So search engines, there are multiple copies of things, so you do things in parallel, just like the brain does. They use queues just like the brain does, but they build it on a substructure that is location addressable so that you can find everything. So that's kind of an existence proof that you can build a system better and have all the advantages without any of the disadvantages.
Offer a little bit of an alternative argument to yours and suggest that a lot of your great findings are evidence really in favor of Shakespeare and Pinker, to the extent that search engines themselves are tools that we have developed that then we can use without the necessity of having to commit all these things to memory.
I would say that the single best thing that we've got going for us is the fact that we are social and that we can acquire culture. So, we can go a long way, especially if there are a lot of us and a lot of patients, in making up for some of the limitations. But it's still really important. This is why I had the stuff in the beginning about ghosts and spirits and bloodletting, and I think I left out flat earthers, and so forth. The thing is that it's easy to confuse what our genome plus our culture gives us with sort of what the genome will give us by ourselves. And so, I'm very thankful that culture allows us to do a lot of stuff, and I think culture could allow us to do even more. But the fact that 100,000 engineers working together over the last 100 years have figured out how to make search engines that are really good, or whatever the numbers are, doesn't mean that the average human being is nearly so clever. So, it's like, you can tell a story about why Einstein is so smart, and you have to relate Einstein to the rest of the species, but you don't want a story about humanity that's just about Einstein. You want one that sort of captures the frailties of ordinary human beings.
I'm kind of struck by your comparison between computer-based location adjustable memory versus the human's content adjustable memory.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought that one of the advantages of content adjustable memory as in human is that it gives a lot of flexibility, intelligence. For example, if you look at half of your face, the location adjustable memory probably will be able to retrieve things well, whereas the human content adjustable should be able to generalize and to get things right better.
On the general point of pattern recognition, I think machines are still way better. People and just biological creatures in general are much better at.
Kind of memory.
Well, I think it's more than that. So, we can emulate content addressability. That's what we do in search engines. We still don't really know what to do with that information to make pattern recognition work. So, there's something that nature has figured out about pattern recognition that we just simply haven't. It probably does draw on the content addressable memory, but even having that, emulating that, doesn't get you there. So there are further things. And I should say, in general, I'm using machines as a tool with which to reflect on what we don't do well, but I'm not trying to argue that machines are in general better than us. As I said, there are lots of things that the machines are no match for us at all. But I think the best thing that one can do is sort of like what people do in search engines, which is they look for all the tips they can get. They look for tips from sort of traditional machine architectures and from how the mind works. And ultimately, if you combine those things, you might come up with something that's better than a classical database and is also better than the human brain. Dr. Perlin in the back.
Is there any evidence that you're aware of to support a hypothesis that it's possible for us to learn to not be overconfident about our opinions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's what a good graduate education does, and certainly that's, I mean, you since you know me, know that part of my research is empirical and experimental, and that's sort of my day job. But what I really like doing is theoretical cognitive science, and theoretical cognitive science is about, I mean, it's the equivalent of theoretical physics. It's about how do all of these things fit together? What's a theory of how it would work? So for my particular profession, I can't afford to be self-delusional. I mean, I can't do the research without being constantly self-critical and thinking about what are the alternatives here. And I think that many scientists, not all, learn to do that, to be self-critical. And there's good empirical evidence, for example, that something as simple as telling oneself to consider alternative hypotheses, if you practice it enough, it's like a golf swing. If you practice it over and over again, it becomes automatic, and then you can do it well. So, I mean, the other virtue we have, it's related to the culture one, is that if we practice things many, many times, we can automate them. And so part of what I'm suggesting is that we should do lots of practice on these kinds of things. Follow-up question.
Yeah, a follow-up question, which was, so I observed that scientists do this within their own fields.
But not outside?
And then I noticed that as soon as those same scientists get outside of their own field of expertise, everything goes bluey really fast. You talk to a scientist about politics, for example, and they're no more rational than everyone else talking about politics. Although it would be nice if they were more rational.
I mean, I don't think that's true of all scientists. I mean, for example, Pinker, although I've been critical of him, I think is pretty good about sort of taking the same tools to a wide domain of things. I think most people aren't. I think most people, really the learning that they do, and this goes back to how that learning is going. What you're doing is you're trying to get your ancestral system to play along. You're trying to get your ancestral system to do the things that you want your deliberate reasoning system to do. So your deliberate reasoning system wants you to reason in a reflective way that balances evidence and so forth. But you got to translate that into something that you can do automatically. And if you don't work really hard at that to try to figure out how do you get it to be an automatic process, then you may wind up with something that's overly specific. Because that system is looking, it's like the scuba divers thing. That system is mostly looking for like a very precise set of circumstances. It's as if you learn to be a balanced reasoner when you're underwater. And so you use the water as a cue. But instead, it's like when you're sitting in the lab, right? And then when you're sitting at home in your couch, that's not a cue to do that. So you have to work hard to make this a habit that you can use always, like walking. I mean, you can always use walking. You don't have to be at home or where else. But you've put in a lot of work to make that habit a generalizable one that you can use in lots of circumstances. The default always, I think, is that when you learn something new, you do put it in a narrow domain. I think one of the biggest problems in education is kids learn stuff in school, and what they learn in school stays at school. And so I think that's the same kind of problem that you're talking about. And it goes back to the ancestral system being about reflexes that are tied to very specific cues. And so you got to broaden the database of cues so that you can invoke the behavior in a wider range of circumstances. Sir?
Early in your talk, when you mentioned how someone said how well evolved the human vision and eye was, I couldn't help but think of soaring birds, which have a visual system that's an order of magnitude better than human, able to resolve incredibly small objects at great distance.
And very quickly, too.
And quickly. It made me think, maybe as opposed to a kludge, how would you respond to the notion that things perhaps in the human mind and system evolved to be good enough, just good enough?
Well, that's exactly what I think a kludge is it's good enough and no better. So I think it's a mistake to expect optimal evolution. Optimal evolution happens sometimes. So in the case of the retina being able to detect a single photon in a darkened room, you're on this kind of smooth surface like Mount Fuji, and it just keeps getting better and better. So our vision wouldn't have to be that good, but there is continued selective pressure, and you need to make only kind of modest modifications to the curvature of the eye and so forth to keep improving that. But on the other hand, the retina is installed backwards, and so we have a blind spot. And in order to fix, but it's good enough. Like, most of the time things aren't in the blind spot, and we have ways of dealing with it. We kludge that so that we have mechanisms for filling in the blind spot and so forth. To fix that, you have to get over onto a whole other mountain. And since what we have is good enough, there's not enough selection pressure on anything that's sort of nearby enough to make things happen, right? If there were a creature that had suddenly had the eye reversed, and in fact, like octopi have a normal retina, if you want to call it, that isn't wired this way. If there were enough selection pressure, it might change, but you're not going to get it by random chance because there are too many things that are intertwined at this point with building a backwards retina. There's all these other mechanisms now that pass the wiring through the front of the retina and stuff, and so it's not a matter of flipping one gene at this point. It might have been 100 million years ago in some earlier development. But now it would require many genes, and it is good enough. It's not perfect, it could be better, but you're not going to get an opportunity to have the better thing because you'd have to change too many genes. Sir?
In the context of this talk, I'm curious what your thoughts are on ADHD, conditions like that.
My thoughts on ADHD. I think that it's a real phenomena. It's probably overdiagnosed. I think some people genuinely have it. I think it's probably overdiagnosed by an order of magnitude or something like that. I think it's a sort of easy, facile diagnosis. And one thing that's hard about it is that the criteria aren't particularly clear. And so it's sort of like, well, you don't have this, you don't have that. And that sort of leaves open whether all of the people that are labeled as that have the same underlying disorder, or whether perhaps there are lots of people that get that same diagnosis that have different underlying disorders. Kind of question about that is, why should it happen at all? And I think that deviations from quote normal performance can happen for lots of reasons. Sometimes it's just a random mutation that carries no virtue. Sometimes it's a deviation that does carry some virtue. So a good example where there is a virtue is in sickle cell anemia. The gene that predisposes people to that also conveys some resistance to malaria. So sometimes there's an offsetting benefit, and sometimes there's not. You can't just sort of look at a disorder and assume that there will be. So in the evolutionary psychiatry literature, there are sort of dubious explanations, for example, for depression. They say, well, the reason that depression evolved is because you want to be submissive to the dominance if you don't have enough wherewithal. You don't want to get into fights with them that you're going to lose and so forth. So that makes you sort of not very active or something like that. But it's not really a very good explanation, because in the extreme, depression can either lead to people being completely dysfunctional as they sit there and they ruminate about how bad things are and they feel discouraged and they don't bother, or even to suicide. So I don't believe that particular story of depression as being adaptive. Whether ADHD is adaptive in some way, I don't know. I mean, I think there are arguments out there. I'm not sure there's any clear data. And I would probably say that in general about most mental disorders, especially the ones where there are many genes that are involved. When there's just one, like PKU, then it's just a particular enzyme just isn't working right. And so if you have this misfunctioning enzyme and you have the wrong diet, then it leads to mental retardation. I don't think there's any adaptive advantage there. It's just a mutation that has a problem. Sometimes there probably are virtues. Maybe the scariest one is some aspects of sociopathy might actually be advantageous to the bearers. I mean, people that will rip other people off in various kinds of ways, it may actually be adaptive, even though it's not sort of good for society as a whole. But since evolution works at the level of the individual, if there aren't too many people like that, then there's some kind of evolutionary balance in it, and then that might go on. Yes?
A point to what you're just saying is, in colorblindness, it's about 10% of men have it, and if they're the hunters, the 10% of men who are colorblind will not necessarily see, will be better able to see animals that are camouflaged. And so, because they're looking at value changes and not color changes, and so they'll be able to survive a little bit longer. So there are survival.
There may be advantage there. I mean, it's not clear to me, for example, why, from a sort of abstract design perspective, you would want more colorblindness in males than females. I mean, you could tell a story about hunting, but it seems to me like that's just an accident of where some of the relevant genes are and on which chromosome they happen to wind up, that you have this sort of sex-linked kind of thing. So, I mean, often the answer, and this is like the answer I was giving a moment ago, may turn out to be that there's an advantage in certain kinds of circumstances that lead to a particular disorder and not in others, and so forth. I mean, there's nothing in nature says that we're necessarily going to get neat solutions to these things where they're all going to come out the same way as all being adaptive or all being non-adaptive. I mean, probably in the talk I overstressed these cases of evolutionary inertia because I think they're interesting and they're understudied and so forth. But the reality is, in evolution, you've got all kinds of cases. You've got cases where there's genuine adaptation. You've got cases where you're stuck with evolutionary inertia. There's random chance and so forth. I don't know enough about the specifics of colorblindness to speak to that particular one. Oh, all right. I'll come to you next. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
What questions are you currently looking to answer with your current research?
Well, I'm mostly interested in the way in which language is a kludge. So I used to think of language as being this sort of separate module in the head. This was a kind of idea that Chomsky and Pinker and Jerry Fodor, kind of all of whom were sort of my heroes in graduate school, were arguing for. And it made a certain amount of sense because language is so different from, human language is so different from what other creatures do. But as I started reading about developmental biology, sort of around the time I had my first sabbatical, I kind of changed my mind about that idea, about there being this wholly separate mechanism for language. So you look at the genome, and our genome isn't very different from chimpanzees, which means there's not a lot of room to sort of build a new module from scratch. And you look at the general considerations I'm talking about evolution as tinkering, and what you should really expect is something like the relation between the hand and the foot. So the hand and the foot have been tuned to do different things, but they have a lot of common history. So yes, the hand is better at grasping, and the foot is better at balancing and so forth, but they're built out of mostly the same stuff, like 95% the same genetically. And I think we need to think about language in that same terms, that language is a tinkering with a lot of stuff that we inherited with chimpanzees. There's some stuff about it that's special that makes it really different, but there's a lot of it that's kludged together out of old parts. And so my day job kind of research is moving more and more in that direction, trying to figure out what aspects of language build on cognitive mechanisms that we inherited that were designed long before language, or not designed, but evolved long before language came onto the scene.
You mentioned the value of teaching thinking skills to children. Do you know of good materials or syllabi that can be used for middle school or high school?
The Harry Stottlemyre's discovery is some of the best stuff that I know about. Generally, the word, I mean, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but the word to search for is metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. That's where I think our curricula should go. I mean, not to the exclusion of anything else, but like I say, if we took out 10% of the time the kids spent in memorizing things and turned it over to metacognition, I think the things would be a lot better. Did you get any online questions? Or?
No, there's a lot of chatter going on about the slides are messed up or something. So
I see.
It's possessing people, but no. They'll fix it, they said.
Going once? Going twice?
Any more questions? Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.